So it's my pleasure to first introduce to you J.D. Porter and Hannah Walser from Stanford University. They're talking about Gendering Literary Audience, a case study in digital feminism. Great.
This project got started when Hannah and I were talking about book reviews that we've read in Esquire magazine and Elle magazine, respectively. And aside from just being happy that they even include book reviews, we noticed that there were stylistic differences between how they were pitching the books to you or talking about them. So we wanted to, we realized that given the DH opportunities available to us, we might be able to look into these a little bit more. People in the past have looked into differences in gender, but primarily from the perspective of written texts. So something like, if we divide authors by gender, what are the differences in the textual features of their works? You can see that in, for instance, the work of Koppel and Jockers.
Yeah, and so part of our goal was to avoid, kind of as Miriam was just talking about, sort of taking gender as a given pre-existing category that we then use to sort text, and we were instead curious about looking at the actual process of constructing gender in the marketplace, right? So how does the field of literature get sort of divided into male and female leaderships, respectively? And we were curious about whether, as a part of this process, we would discover different sort of theories of literary value and potentially of kind of the affective experience of reading literature in these two gendered corpora.
This is the corpus that we were working with. We found 78 reviews in Esquire and 109 in Elle. This is an extremely provisional project. We want to have better matched corpora and better matched time periods, ideally, but this is enough to kind of get started and say a few things. A lot from both. They cover slightly different time periods, but about 7 years in both cases.
And just to kind of, for those who don't know, this is what we're dealing with. Elle is essentially a women's fashion and celebrity magazine. It's kind of lifestyle oriented, but it does have a section for reviews of movies, books, etc.
Esquire is, I guess, a men's lifestyle magazine. You can see that it thinks of itself as dealing with these big things like the meaning of life, wisdom, and damn good advice is what it says up there. Yet it's still just a picture of a celebrity, so it is what it is.
So first, a little bit of data on the reviewers of the novels in these magazines. So the blue here, the blue bars are Esquire, the red are Elle, and you can see that the reviewer breakdown, just in terms of numbers, is very heavily gender stacked. But looking at the number of reviews written by men and women respectively is another way to visualize this. And in this case, we can see that Elle actually has one male reviewer in particular who produces a lot of their reviews, and so that leads to a slightly more balanced outcome. Esquire, the female stripe there, is very small, smaller than the unknown or unattributed.
When we look at who's writing the books that they're reviewing, you can see that in Elle, although it is disproportionately frequently by female authors, you do have some representation of male authors. When it comes to Esquire, there is only one female author in the entire 78 review corpus that we looked at, tied with Unknown, which is from when they decided to review the Quran. Which we don't know who wrote that, but we feel safe in assuming probably our key unit of analysis for this talk was just most distinctive words. If anybody doesn't know, this is just a way of identifying the words that occur in some group of texts disproportionately often. So they're distinctive of that text versus any other text. These are the ones that we found in these magazines. You've got she, her, family, etc. on this side. Falling, should, dead, books, etc. on this side. I don't know if you guys want to think about if it's easy to guess which one is which, but it actually, would be surprising if anybody couldn't figure this out pretty quickly.
So looking at the entire list of MDWs, we noticed a few patterns. So obviously you saw that in the Elle list, there were quite a few more gender terms, she, her, woman. And there were also a lot of family terms, which is potentially related to kind of the emphasis on relatability and sort of relating things back to your own life that we find in the reviews. So family dynamics represent a kind of core set of plots that are interesting here. So there's a more explicit language of aesthetics than you find in Esquire, at least a particular kind of aesthetics, so beauty is a keyword here, as is art. But there are also these interesting semi-emotional, semi-aesthetic words like voice and heart, which are used both to characterize a reader's experience of a text and to label the kind of style of an individual writer or the aesthetic kind of origin of the text. And then we have this weird cluster that we're labeling building that seems to have a sort of micro-skeletal plot in it. So young, marriage, away, university, York, which is New York, we're pretty sure, sexual experience in the city. What's interesting here is that we're getting in the language of these reviews a kind of slightly distorted image of the prototypical kind of L novel plot, which would be one of a young woman leaving home for an urban center.
Moves to the city. In Esquire, the first interesting thing that we notice is you get a lot of these explicitly literary terms, not just books, plot, writers, and novels, but actually the word literature. It's of a piece with this third bullet point here, grand social issues, your problems, reality, idea, and culture, that they're thinking of and pitching to their readers this idea of books as like a grand cultural thing that you're supposed to participate in, almost like a responsibility. They couple this with a direct appeal. So, you know, words of value like worth, enough, and perfect, but also just you, bad, and good. You're much more likely in Esquire to get you should read this book because it is good. And it will make you a good person, you know. A more surprising finding was this absence, mourning, and sorrow kind of cluster of words. Falling is actually the most distinctive word. We were a little surprised by that. You find that it is kind of in league with, or in sync with dead, fall, alone, gone, lost. Not totally clear why this would be true, except that it does seem to fit maybe with the idea of sort of a naive version of seriousness. Like, let's look at the things that are very important in our problematic reality ideas and culture. Another way of looking at the MDWs is just by syllable count. What you find is that Esquire words are on average quite a bit shorter than L words. This is just the top 50, but there's many more one-syllable words in Esquire. Perhaps this is some sort of Hemingway influence. He did used to write for the magazine back in its early days. But it also does seem to be related to this sort of like direct appeal and simple language.
So there was actually only one novel that was reviewed in both corpora, and this is a 5-year span, so that's kind of surprising. But it's this one, it's The Bright Night by Chris Adrian. It is a modern updating of A Midsummer Night's Dream set in Buena Vista Park, San Francisco, if that's of interest to anyone. So if we look at the reviews, if we compare these two reviews directly as a sort of control condition, we find a few factors that we weren't able to capture through MDWs that might be interesting to look at in the future. Syntax varies considerably. L is really reliant on these kind of long adjectival phrases, often hyphenated into almost Germanic compounds. So near hardcore body is kind of my, favorite or least favorite in its awkwardness. Esquire, on the other hand, uses many more sentence fragments and direct address. So this kind of fits into the explicit recommendation model. Still with us, good. Don't abandon this just because it's based on Shakespeare. It's basically
or you left to build a house or something.
Yeah. There's also a difference in prosody. L has more linguistic pyrotechnics in general, but especially alliteration. Hallucinatory high spirits here. L also uses more and longer quotations, and paratext is different in each of these cases. Esquire lists prices more often, so these are kind of future avenues to look at.
We found that there may be content differences between what's getting reviewed in these. This came to our attention when we noticed that collection is showing up more frequently in L than in Esquire, and it does seem to jive with our experience that L seems more interested in reviewing, for instance, a short story collection. Esquire also talks about kind of airport novels a lot more. If you noticed King in the MDW list, that's Stephen. He's one of their most reviewed writers, and they have a bit of a complex about it. Every so often they'll write about whether or not you should read things like Stephen King, but it comes up a lot.
So we're also curious about whether this gendered discourse has ramifications in other publications, and especially in reviews that aren't explicitly pitched to a mainly female audience. So if these two kind of styles represent points on a spectrum, or more likely in a kind of space, where would something like the Sunday New York Times book review fall in that category? So I would, for instance, guess that it would be closer to the L model in that it's using longer sentences, longer words, and also kind of framing, on a more abstract level, framing the reading experience as a kind of personal, pleasurable activity that you do to kind of enrich your own subjectivity, as opposed to the kind of great tradition Esquire model.
Yeah, so we might expect academic criticism to fall closer to the Esquire, and this is purely speculative at this point, closer to the Esquire kind of language, which is, as you saw, first of all, has actual literary terminology in it, plot, literature, books, writers, but also seems to be interested in ideas of like value, ranking the literature against itself, talking about culture and big ideas, and views reading it as somewhat more of a responsibility or something, like how you become a good man is to like make your son read novels with you, as opposed to like doing it, because it might be fun.
Academic criticism has far less profanity.
Yeah, Esquire does have more profanity too than L, but it didn't make it into the MDW.
So that's about it, actually.
Yeah, we somehow came in under time.
Yeah.
All right. So next up in the gold room, where you just came from, is Anne Conwin's talk, Digital Pedagogy and Transformative Digital Humanities. I think my biggest question is just that L and Esquire, it seems to me, are really targeting a certain kind of woman or a certain kind of man. And so in that sense, to say take that as a model and then apply it broadly to the New York Times or to all these different other channels, seems like potentially that it has limits, maybe.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's like the very first thing to say about this is just how provisional it is.
Oh, right.
And that you absolutely need to add in lots more text before you would get to the kinds of generalizations.
Yeah.
But I think particularly kind of one of the things you're pointing at is, for instance, there's a huge class component here that we didn't really have time to address. But that, so just in that L, right, is sort of has a complicated position where it's advertising luxury goods to middle class readers, right? Esquire, I don't know as much about where it's
Esquire is pretty same kind
but
of
same
thing.
kind of thing. And so there's a particular, for instance, kind of aspirational language of sort of middle class cultural capital, accrued cultural capital that you get here,
too.
and a very white one.
There's not a lot of diversity.
So yeah, this had, in general, this project so far is kind of, doing its best with a non-intersectional or non-kind of fleshed out sort of model of gender. But I think, adding in a larger corpus would provide the opportunity to see how much of this is coming from, the whiteness and the middle classness of these magazines versus how much of it is sort of being used to mark out these gendered audiences. So,
right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you have like an idea of other works you write?
It's pretty hard to find magazines marketed to men that have book reviews. Like GQ, L is much more popular than Esquire in sales, and GQ is a little more comparable, but just that I couldn't find. It wasn't as easy to find reviews in it for me. So, so I don't know. I mean, it might be that you would just want a lot of general interest stuff, like the New Yorker.
Yeah.
But
it's a little bit more possible with women's magazines, which is in itself interesting, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But it would be also interesting to look at from kind of a class angle, something like, say, Vanity Fair, right, which is not specifically masculine or feminine in its orientation, but is definitely kind of, again, this sort of like luxury model of sort of what that what a very affluent life would look like. So
or something like even like Ebony or like Christian Science Monitor or something where there's like a identity marker that's different from what we've been talking about, just to be able to see if there's anything to disentangle. I mean, there must be things to disentangle, but to be able to get at them in some way.
Cool. That's I really look forward to your project, how it turns out.
Thanks.
Is it for a paper or?
We just did it for this, basically.
I don't know. We could have,
All right. So just before we start, this is Amanda Phillips from UC Davis, currently a postdoc there, and she's talking about Game Camp by Moth Lab, open source game design workshops.
All right. see if my slideshow wants to work. There it goes. Everybody can see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm gonna be, so first of all, hi. It's kind of strange to be virtually there right now. I woke up in Texas this morning, so Texas to Davis, and now I'm transported into Santa Barbara. But I'm excited to be a part of the, I couldn't believe this is the 8th annual Research Slam iteration. So I feel old. Let me get my phone because people are tweeting at me right now. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Game Camp by ModLab. And basically, Game Camp is a year-long workshop series culminating in a month-long game jam, which we launched already this month. So a series of game design workshops that are for both programmers and non-programmers. So we teach them general game design principles, and as well as a little bit of tech skills. So, you might, those of you who are at Santa Barbara might see this sort of like forerunner of this in the English class that I taught, where I took English majors and asked them to design social justice games for social justice over the course of a quarter. So I'm really interested in low tech tools to get students involved and more people generally involved in game design. We have a website, which is ucdavisgamecamp.wordpress.com. And you can actually find all of the workshops that we've done available online there that you can download. It's Creative Commons license, so you can remix them, adjust them to suit your own needs. But we're really excited to have produced these this year. I worked with Joseph Nguyen, who unfortunately was not able to be with us today, but he's a grad student here in English. And so he and I really pioneered this project. This was one of the major projects that I did as a postdoc, but I'm really grateful for Joseph's assistance and his co-facilitation of all the workshops. And you can see his Twitter handle there. He just joined Twitter, so if someone wants to tweet at him, I'm sure that'd make him very happy. And also, my Twitter account is Ask the Mad, for those of you who are not familiar. We're working with a group called ModLab, which is at UC Davis campus, is an interdisciplinary digital humanities and game studies research laboratory. We have about 30 faculty, graduate, and undergraduate researchers from across campus. And so it's sort of along the model of transcriptions for those of you at UCSB, but I think we have a little bit more formal structure in that we have weekly meetings and that sort of thing. Very fortunate to be funded, not only ModLab in general, but specifically the Game Camp. I want to make sure we acknowledge our sponsors, which is the IFA Cluster and Gamification in the Digital Humanities here at UC Davis, the Mellon Research Initiative in Digital Cultures, the Immersed Video Games Research Network, which funds my postdoc, and then also the Davis Humanities Institute. We were also able to coordinate with the game dev at Davis Group. And so those of you who are thinking about doing this kind of stuff, I highly recommend checking out what undergraduate programs are out there in your institutions, because these kids were absolutely amazing. They come out of the computer science club at Davis, and they were really, gave us a lot of help with the tech workshops in particular. They already knew a lot of stuff, and so some of the things that we were able to teach them were mainly sort of design principles. Also, another great resource for people interested in game design is the International Game Developers Association. There was a chapter in Sacramento here that we were able to hook up with and work with a little bit. But in general, IGDA is really great for students. As a graduate student, I was able to go to GDC free of charge just by volunteering at their booth. So I always recommend the IGDA as a resource for students or people who are interested in game design pedagogy. So just a little bit of a review of the workshops that are available. We designed 4 major ones and then gave a bunch of tech workshops in this like horrific slog of workshops in April, which I don't recommend doing. But just to jump right into it, the emphasis for our first workshop was on rule systems and their importance to the overall design process. Some of you might recognize this activity as an adapted version of the Mali Industria paper prototyping activity. So the idea behind this is that we generally understand rule systems to be about the fun of a game, but the workshop used asked students to remix old classic arcade games to tackle social problems, to demonstrate how rule systems are important for the meaning of the game as well. Some of the major takeaways from the paper prototype workshop were that rules, of course, are fundamental to both the fun and the meaning of a game. Also, that modding something you already know is a good way to generate new ideas. So again, we were focusing on creativity for these students to help them kind of come up with new ideas for their games. And using paper to map out the game is a crucial part of the design process. So anyone who is interested in game design, I highly recommend, and many game designers highly recommend, getting your ideas out on paper first, because once you try to implement them in digital form, programming will add all sorts of new layers of complications. So if you don't have a really strong idea of what you're trying to do, then that will become a problem pretty quickly. A second workshop that we did talked about game genres and asked the students to come up with several quick game concepts that smash together two genres around a particular theme. So we asked them to randomly generate these genres with dice, and we gave them a chart. They rolled dice, came up and consulted the chart, so they got two different genres and one random theme that they had to mix this all together. And we did this, I think we gave them 3 to 5 minutes. It says so in the workshop, I forget exactly what we used, but 3 to 5 minutes to come up with a bunch of different ones. And then we gave them about half an hour at the end of the workshop to develop a fuller, one of those ideas fuller, to think about how it become more of a game. So this workshop emphasized the importance of using and breaking established conventions and expected rules, which is important, you know, for, again, generating new ideas. We tried to focus on genres that are easier to create in a short amount of time, so stuff like platformers. And the workshop also demonstrated that you can come up with lots of different concepts very quickly, which, since we were trying to prepare them for this game jam, is really important in training for a game jam because it's such a quick, time-sensitive activity. So takeaways from that are ground your game in established conventions, but break them just enough to make it interesting. So we talked to the students about, you know, what expectations of your potential gamers, how that would be important in the final product. Also asking them to implement unexpected constraints, which can generate novel concepts that you might not have considered before. And you can make a game out of game making. So we played a creativity game with them. The last workshop that I'm going to talk to you about, or just sort of give you a quick overview, was walking students through how computers think and execute complex instructions by breaking them down into incremental sets governed by control logics like looping and conditional. So this is the sort of like programming basics for non-programmers. We used a series of flowcharts to help illustrate this for people who may not be familiar with the principles of computer programming. And then we asked them, and this was actually a really fun activity, and I think this is the favorite of the entire game camp. We asked them to play an analog version of a match 3 candy game, which for copyright reasons we opted to call Sugar Slaughter Story. But essentially we made an analog, just when I came up with flowcharts, to play an analog version of Candy Crush on the table. And it was really great and a super frustrating activity, but allowing the students to get through that frustration of, no, the computer would actually check every single location, or however you might program it, really hammered in for them just how sort of consistent and obedient and rule-following computers are. They can't just slide all the candy down. So that's one of the major takeaways, of course, is that computers are obedient, sequential thinkers that enforce rules and procedures, absolutely, but at a very fast pace. So some things took them a lot longer to do when they played at the analog versions, but some things, or when they played as a computer, but some things would be a lot quicker just as a human to say, oh, I know all of these 3 match, let's pull them off. A computer has to scan and like identify those things. Break tasks into a step-by-step instructions to identify procedures that the computer will need to perform for your game. And so again, this is getting students to think procedurally, helping them to think like a computer when they may not have any experience in it. And then finally, that flowcharts are a great way to map out procedural logic. So if you're going to do any kind of programming or any sort of cause and effect within your game, using flowcharts as a way to map that out ahead of time is really important. We did 2 versions of Game Camp. One was for undergraduates, and then we also did a faculty, grad, and staff. This procedural thinking activity was actually a favorite of faculty members in particular. We had one English professor who's been working on a game here who was very, very excited to finally understand why the programmers were having such a hard time doing exactly what she wanted them to do in her game. So that was actually really useful. Okay, so the last thing that we did were technical workshops, and this just a picture of Joseph sort of guiding students through a Unity tutorial. We do have very basic tutorials for Unity up on the website. And then we also pulled from the expertise of the UC Davis game dev kids to give us tutorials in Blender, which is an open source animation and modeling, 3D modeling workshop. And then finally, there are lots of online tutorials to use GameMaker, Twine, and Scratch, and so we made use of those within Game Camp to kind of give them some technical skills and an introduction. All right, so that's all I have. You can go to ucdavisgamecamp.wordpress.com again to access all these resources and read the blogs and the sort of like overview of what we did over the quarter. I guess I can take you there real quick since I have the screen captive right now. Oh, there's SyncDH. And UC Davis Game Camp, and then I'll stop there. Just want to show you the really cute little logo that we had. We actually had a student competition for the logo, and somebody came up with a really great little guy. And then this is him on a poster. So thanks a lot. I hope these resources are useful for you, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. We have time for one question. If you want to take one question. Can
Sure.
you hear me? Okay.
Questions from the audience?
Your respondent, Porter.
Should I ask it now or the?
Well, you could ask our first one and then continue.
Yeah, here's one question. I found it really fascinating, the paper prototype takeaways, and then you were also sort of returning back to the analog with your sequential candy destroyer game, or whatever is an acceptable way to say it. That relationship between the analog and the digital, I thought was really fascinating. I wonder if you have any takeaways from that about just DH more broadly, and especially pedagogically.
I mean, about DH more broadly, I will have to think about that. But pedagogically, I think it was very useful for the students because we worked with some computer programmers, but even they learned stuff from the paper prototyping things, to think about computers in ways that they didn't before. But I think starting with paper really helped students who were intimidated by programming and by procedurality in general to really get a grasp on the sort of specific steps. So with the first paper prototyping activity, there were games there, and if you've seen the Molly and Justria activity, it's using games that people are very familiar with, so stuff like Super Mario Brothers, Pac-Man, and those sorts of things. And you can sort of think about how those games operate and then represent them in different ways to go along with the goal of the workshop, which was to think about a social issue. So I think that really helped to isolate the concepts from the computer in ways that helped students.
Thank you so much.
All right, so up next we have Ryan Huser, and he's talking about virtual poetics, a thought experiment.
I'm going to come into the webcam and ask another question. I actually just kind of wanted to invite you to say a little more about the social issue component of this. Maybe an example or something about how the students were able to relate kind of social justice questions to these activities.
Yeah, so that's a sort of carryover. So when I first taught the game design class that I did in the English department, I specifically wanted students to be thinking about social issues the entire time. And what that did was kind of force them to create games that were informed by theory. So they had to create a bibliography and do research and stuff before they actually designed their games. In the Game Camp workshop, since it was a much shorter time constraint, I mean, it's just really cool putting random constraints on people because they come up with really creative ideas. So one of the games off the top of my head that I can think of that came out of that particular activity was a game called Lung Invaders, and this was actually designed by people from our faculty and grad student group. And so Lung Invaders was about pollution, and it used the Space Invaders video game to think about the houses on the bottom were sort of represented people, or like the health of the people or whatever. And your little guns were shooting, they represented resources. And the guns were shooting the Space Invaders, which were pollutants in the air. And so as the space invaders reach your houses or your resources, they sort of deteriorate over time. But they split it so that it was a double screen, and so one side of the screen had a ton more resources and less pollution, and the other side had fewer resources but more pollution attacking them, to kind of think about social inequality and how that has to do with environmental justice. And then they had a bonus score mechanic. So in Space Invaders, there's a little special alien that goes across the top, and if you shoot it down, you get lots of bonus points. Well, that in their game represented Energy Star rating, right? In which sort of gives the idea of different communities get accolades or even more resources for keeping their already clean communities cleaner. And so what it did was, because there was so much pollution, you couldn't get the good Energy Star rating, but in the cleaner or already sort of like rich neighborhoods, you were able to get the Energy Star rating. And so it was sort of like to demonstrate the compounding effects of a lot of times wealthier communities have more resources to clean up, or they ship their pollution out to other places, which happens a lot as well. And so I thought that was a really cool way of thinking about that sort of space shooter game as a way to think about environmental justice.
Yeah, that's awesome. This is a fantastic project.
Welcome back to the Blue Room. We have Zach Horton from UCSB talking about scalar mediation, network graphing powers of 10.
Give me one moment. Trying to get my remote working.
Yeah, give me a smile. 1, 2, 3, all right.
All right. All right. Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm just going to present a few fragments from a work in progress. A kind of a strange or different, for me at least, way of using network analysis, network graphing. So my larger project that this is part of is about scalar mediation, right? Which is the ways that particular media forms produce, stabilize, and engage radically disparate scales. So that's the larger background. But I'll jump right in. So one of the things I'm interested in is the form of the cosmic zoom, which in the latter half of the 20th century to the present has been really popular. And this is a form of media that starts with either the smallest known entity in the universe, or the universe as a whole, and then moves to the other end, kind of linearly like this. It's a giant zoom from the tiniest to the largest of the entire universe. All right, so one example of this, the first example in the 20th century, in the robust kind of sense of the cosmic zoom, is this book, Cosmic View, by radical Dutch schoolmaster Kees Boek. So this book actually starts out with this image of a girl, a student, sitting in the courtyard of the school itself with a cat, and then each successive page jumps one scale larger, revealing a whale is also there, strangely. And this keeps going, so it's 1 power of 10 higher up in each successive image, and then text explains what's happening at this scale, what sort of events are taking place, what can be resolved or not resolved at this scale, how it connects to other scales, etc. Right, so it goes all the way up out to the edges of the universe, and then all the way back down to the nucleus of an atom. Right. So what I thought would be interesting is actually network graphing the scalar relationships within this work. Right. So there are 40 discrete scales, each is a node on this graph. The green nodes are ones that contain in the work intrascalar dynamics, which is to say events or processes that are represented as happening within that scale, right? So ecologically, we could think of them as active scales. The white nodes, which there are only a few over here, are lack any kind of dynamics within the scale itself. The edges on this graph represent connections between scales, right? So we have these 40 discrete scales, and then some of them connect to other scales. Each one connects actually to 2 other scales. So if we look down here at the large end of the scales, from the universe on down to the planet or so, we actually see that these are completely linearly connected. So each one of these edges is bidirectional because it's a book, and you can flip the book forward or backward, the pages forward or backward. So each scale connects to its 2 contiguous spatial scales but has no other connections. On the other hand, all of these are extremely active scales in terms of the dynamics within them, right? These are all green. If you look at the other end, it's a bit different. You start to get more interconnections. You have this cluster of the smaller scales, which are highly, or at least somewhat interconnected, right? So they actually have processes that span scales and connect them together. Maybe not surprisingly, the most privileged node here is the human body, as you can see, right? Which a lot of scales connect to, and which connects to a few other scales. So you can see the kind of anthropocentrism that's actually kind of latent within a work like this. But interestingly, down at this end, you have very small, at the interatomic scale, or intraatomic scale, I should say, you actually have you have its own kind of cluster, its own network cluster. And curiously, these are also the scales that, the very few scales that actually are not represented as having their own dynamics within them. So they're highly connected, they're tiny, but they don't have much going on. They're inert without those connections. You can kind of see the sort of politics of scale happening here. So I want to move on to another work, which is in 1968. This is a film made by Ray and Charles Eames, the famous American designers. It has a really complex, long title. It's called A Rough Sketch of a Proposed Film Dealing with the Powers of 10 and the Size of Things in the Universe. But it's normally abbreviated to Rough Sketch. So this is really an animation of that book directly, right? So it's an attempt to put in film terms this cosmic museum.
So we now see a whole solar system.
Just stop that. Okay, so when we network graph that, it looks like this. So in some ways, you can see the fidelity to the original book. It's rather linear, but you can see that we have these different kind of clusters happening here, right? So you have some more interconnection happening at different places, but you also have this interesting bifurcation that's happening here. So many of the intrascalar dynamics, the things happening at these discrete scales, drops out of the picture entirely, right? And so you see it's about half now. Only about half actually are described as active rather than inert scales. And also those happen to be the most connected to other scales, have the most interscalar dynamics. So this is really interesting. You have this kind of double privileging of certain scales at the expense of these other scales. Then the Eames remade this into their most iconic and famous film, which is called Powers of 10 in 1977. So this is a decade later that they produced this film, which, and here they bring in nuclear physicist, Philip Morrison.
In the nucleus of a carbon atom, beneath the vanishing an outer layer of cells,
so here we go.
healthy collagen.
So this is Philip Morrison narrating. He wrote the narration
containing red blood cells
and performs it. And he actually has this great interest in scale. He's a nuclear physicist, worked on the Manhattan Project, and is also an astrophysicist and founded SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And so he actually has this kind of theory or model of the universe that highly privileges intraatomic particles, right? So subatomic particles, particularly electrons and protons. And he calls these universal modules in the film and in his other works. And these universal modules are perfect and historyless. They can't change, but they give rise to everything else. It's kind of a dualistic concept of the universe. All other matter is imperfect and changes and has a history and is stabilized by those scales. So he actually encodes that into this narration, and when you graph it, it looks like this. So it's kind of a radical mutation in this project as a result of his kind of ideology of matter, right? And you can see that, that there are a couple of these privilege scales that his narration falls across that actually connect and order the rest of the universe, literally. And yet you still have a relative paucity of dynamics happening within scales, right? But you do have this decentering of the human body as the center that holds together the universe in terms of this model, right? This scalar model. So this is interesting. But we still have those other problems. And so one of the things that's really interesting that comes about from this kind of graphing, so obviously these are using tools that are meant for social network mapping, or economic relationships or whatever, and that's how we normally use these tools. So it's there's a kind of conceptual leap that has to happen to think of using a kind of networked form to think about something conceptual like scalar relationships, right? So what I'm interested in is a couple things. One is that what it does reveal about the kind of latent scalar structure of particular works, and that actually ends up being a kind of model of the universe, right? Each of these is in some sense a different way of ordering and thinking about our relationship to the rest of the universe as humans. But also using these tools, if you use the same layout algorithm, so every one of these graphs that use the same layout algorithm, right? So the computer is doing the work of actually creating the design of the graph. So by taking that out of my hands, it allows me to compare directly these different media forms, right? You know, I haven't created the graph in that sense, although I've interpreted the data, of course. So that is really remarkable when you think about what happens when you graph, for instance, the next work, which was a book based on the 1977 film, but after Charles Eames had died, and so Philip Morrison kind of takes over, right? So when he takes over and reorders this as a book, a highly influential book like the film, this is what you get. Again, same layout algorithm, not my design, right? And so this, if you're interested in the environmental humanities, as I am, this starts to make you think, right? Like, well, what is it? Like, what is this strange coincidence that actually maps this work, when mapped in this way, produces a set of scalar relationships that comes out remarkably like a fish, an organism. And I can't go through all the details now, but if you want to talk to me, we can talk about it. There are actually reasons why it actually makes kind of sense as an organism. In other words, there are certain scalar paths, like you can get to small, from the large to the small, through two different kind of primary pathways. Like there is a tail section that functions in a certain way with this really privileged node. The inner solar system in this case is the most significant scale in some ways in terms of the network flow. Right, so there are a lot of reasons, but this made me think, well, actually, we have some other results here. So besides quantitative analysis, there's another layer, a kind of qualitative layer that can come out of that if we start to think creatively and use these tools creatively. And so I started to think, well, what if really this entire genre of these cosmic view works are in some sense kind of scalar organisms, right? What happens if we think of them that way? Like, do we end up having something like a menagerie, right, of different organisms? These are other works that I haven't talked about that are also cosmic zooms. This is the CD-ROM version that got produced in the 1990s and turned out to be the most highly connected. So anyway, this led me to ask. You know, what we get from creating a kind of loop between the quantitative and the qualitative, right? And so I think this reveals a kind of politics of scale. Each one of these we could ask, well, how does this, as a kind of quasi-organism, how does it function in ordering and experiencing the world, right? In experiencing the world and ordering it for us, right? So actually, they're heavily embedded, you could say, politics or philosophies of scale, size, and universal structure within these. And so then that leads us to ask, like, which of these is maybe a more generative way to order and approach the universe? Thank you.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on the ways in which the different media affect the process of scaling. You talk about books, films. It looks like there's an interactive CD-ROM in one of these cases, and it makes sense to my mind that an interactive device would have the greatest number of connections across the various layers, just intuitively thinking about the ways in which games are often structured to give you multiple affordances. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the mediated effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for instance, let's try to bring this into free-floating mode here. If you look at one of the books, we'll look at the fish book. Try to. You can see, you get a couple things. First of all, books are bidirectional in terms of the way the media produces a certain way of navigation, right? A certain modality of navigation that allows you to flip pages. So books are inherently nonlinear in that sense, which creates a number of these kind of bidirectional edges, connecting scales in kind of multiple ways. But whereas films are linear, and in particular, you can see films, I won't bring it up that dictate to you kind of what scale you can go to from any given scale, right? And sometimes they're bidirectional because they move in one direction and then they move back in the other direction again.
Right.
And sometimes they're not, or certain segments are not. So if you look at these graphs closely, you can kind of actually see the affordances of the media playing out in terms of possible ways of navigating through it, right, as a network. And the CD-ROM is just really extraordinary. This extraordinary work, and in order to analyze it, I didn't assume that you can get just anywhere from any scale. So it's not just a question of navigating, because what I'm looking at are scalar relationships. It's not just navigation, right? So so not every scale is connected to every other scale. It's not a perfectly connected graph here, but it's a highly connected graph. There's some 700 edges in this graph with only 42, I think, nodes. Which is highly interconnected, as you can see. And so there are different affordances within the CD-ROM that actually allow for this. There are different interfaces. For instance, there's kind of random scale jumps, or these thematic kind of cross-reference points within each scale that take you to certain other scales as a result of a certain theme, like people or symbols or whatever. Yeah.
And how do you think the agency of the viewer or the reader impacts this? And you're describing the reader flipping the page back and forth, whereas in your model of the film plays and you watch, and the film manages that experience as opposed to pausing and rewinding.
Right. I mean, I think of this as a kind of map of viewer of affordances for the viewer. Right. So where can you go from any place? What model does it give you? Of course, you can create your own model, right? You can create your own readerly model of how to navigate scale. And you can find your own connections between scales, but there are certain constraints that the actual medial form gives you, and that's what I think of this as, a set of constraints and affordances that you can then, of course, subvert and find your own connections. But most viewers, of course, will take a certain model of the universe from this and think about these interconnection skills in a certain way without going the extra step of adding, because all of these forms, none of these forms actually allow you to add your own content.
Gotcha. And so just a little historical question. What's the first cosmic zoom? When you said it, I was thinking of that scene in Men in Black where we go from the universe down to like Agent J.
Right.
That was my first.
That happens at about the same time as this, so which is to say the late 90s.
Right.
And that's the kind of, second stage of the cosmic zoom, because the first stage of that original book in 1957 is the beginning.
Gotcha.
There are media forms and imaginative forms before that do think about viewing the universe from, or the solar system from afar, or seeing the large and the small aside each other. But this actual form of zooming or jumping in a kind of continuous linear manner through all the scales without moving around in space, that really only happens in 1957 with that book. So that's the big thing.
Great. That's all I got.
Yeah, thanks. Have another day. They'll stop it. Or they'll do something. Yeah, thanks for being respondent. Happy to do it.
This is cool. I haven't used Prezi in a long time. It looks like it's gotten better.
Oh yeah?
I tried it years ago, and
it's still clunky to like make it do what you want. But because you have to do a million workarounds, and when you actually get it to do what you want, it's great.
Yeah, it was really effective for this format, so you could see everything like spatially referenced in a way.
Right, and I try not to make it. I try not to use Prezi in ways that are flashy.
Just PowerPoint.
Right.
Just PowerPoint.
Or just PowerPoint, or just flashy because it's Prezi. Spinning things around and all that kind of stuff. I try to actually just use it for its strengths.
Yeah.
So welcome back to the Blue Room. I'll introduce myself because I am the next speaker. So I am Ashley, and What is a Reviewer is my title. I did change that last night, which is why it's different than your sheet. So I'm looking at how sites of public literary consumption influence reading practices. So for this presentation, which largely comes out of just the starting blocks of my dissertation thinking, which is looking at Goodreads. So this is a site that has had a lot of success, and there has 25 million users. And I'm looking at how Goodreads influences reading practices and how we can trace patterns on the site. And specifically for this presentation, I wanted to look at politically motivated books, or books that require a certain response of the reader. So that the book that I chose is not something that would necessarily require just a range of responses, but is very directed towards a certain response. So I'm really picking up on Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message idea here, that the medium here is going to affect reading. So Goodreads, it's hugely successful. This tweet is one example of the very many tweets, the very many blogs that talk about how influential Goodreads has been. So here, this person tweeted, "Anyone who says they don't have time to read just hasn't found the right book yet. Goodreads has made me start enjoying reading again." There's a lot of other blogs that talk about how readers have finally found communities where they can read about works from minority writers or other collections of literature that they otherwise didn't find a place to read. So on the site, reviewers become quantifiably high ranked on the social cataloging site by the number of books they review. So all of that is listed, and the likes their reviews have acquired as they gain followers. So all this leads to their success. So pictured here was the #1 reviewer of 2014, and she wrote about 30 reviews a week. And amazingly, she writes books in her spare time. So she was listed as GR famous. So that is the label that she got for achieving that amount of success on the site. So what I want to be critical about is just how do likes and followers influence reading practices? How does the medium of Goodreads influence reading and reviewing? So Goodreads specifically says that they give the GR Famous Award not for people acquiring likes and followers, though that is in actuality how somebody becomes awarded that particular award. So the book I chose is Louise Erdrich's The Round House. And I'll just, so you have a pathway to where I'm going here, is that I'm looking at how literature reviews become quantifiable and evaluative rather than qualitative and analytical. So qualitative and analytical being much more in line with our general humanistic practice in literature classes versus quantifiable and evaluative, which is less practiced. So Louise Erdrich's The Round House, it was published in 2012. I say it's politically motivated because it's a novel about the rape of a Native American woman by a non-Native man, and it generated many evaluative responses on Goodreads, on its success or failure, based on the user's respective opinions. The work is credited with changing the law with regard to tribal jurisdiction through the Violence Against Women Act in 2013. And the reason for this is because it raises this, it demands a certain response of the reader to react against the problems that this Native American woman faces after she is raped. There's no justice that she can seek. She's traumatized. She doesn't know where the rape occurred. She doesn't know if it was on tribal land or if it was on state land, and all this matters because the laws are different depending on where the rape happened. So that's what I mean when it says it really demands a certain response. And the law, the Violence Against Women Act, was changed in 2013, a year after the book is published. So you can see the pretty quick response to this book. So there are many reviews on The Round House. There's many reviews on many books. There's about 9,000 of The Round House. This I picked, it's one of the top reviews. It's also emblematic of the whole. So I'll just read that. Most interesting to me were the Native American customs described in the lore. Such a brilliant culture. Christianity seems seamlessly blended into it. Indeed, one of the novel's colorful characters is the eccentric ex-Marine Catholic priest who the kids initially suspect and later come to revere. The people believe in totems, ghosts, and dreams. They also believe in the Virgin Mary. So this response is trying, I think, in a way to identify with the work in some way. So there's this sense in which the reader wants to acknowledge something that's similar to their own beliefs. So I might imagine that here it's Catholicism. In actuality, the ex-Marine Catholic priest is not her ally, Geraldine's ally in the book. In fact, nobody seems to really fight for her search for justice. So the project led me to ask just what is Goodreads reading practices tell us about what good humanistic practice is. So Goodreads, to be very fair to Goodreads, it's about good reads. It's about identifying what are good reads, how do you evaluate good reads. It's not really about good reading. So we can't really read it on that site to say that it's necessarily going to produce this good reading. We can't do that. But I think that we can read Goodreads as a site that demonstrates how people do end up reading. And so I think what you see is that there's this repeated flattening of cultural differences on the site as the reader tries to identify with the work. So here the reader was trying to identify with the cultural differences and trauma, and it didn't work successfully, but that was the motive. And so I thought about this, and I thought the central tenet of good literary scholarship is the ability to hold the differences open between him or herself and the arguments in literature, and that good humanistic qualitative scholarship illuminates those deep differences that I cannot say that I would experience, of course, the same thing as this Native American woman who was raped. The law would be different to me than it was to her in 2012. And so this is just a very brief collection of different ways that I'm trying to look at how the specialist reviews literature versus the non-specialist. And a lot of times with the non-specialist, their responses are quantitative. They're motivated by stars and likes, and we have to view that as part of the reading practice on Goodreads. It can't be divorced from that. And also that it's very evaluative rather than quantitative and analytical, which is what we generally teach in literature departments. So this is just sort of an experiment for me, which is that a lot of times when I read Goodreads, it's non-specialists reading it, and so I don't have a clear sense of how does the medium affect specialists in literary studies, and many of you are specialists, and so I made a usability quiz for you all. So you can use that in the CRC or on your laptop. And what the quiz is really trying to get at is just trying to look at Goodreads yourself, trying to write a response on Goodreads to a text you know about, and to gauge how your experience is on the site, being that you are specialists in literature, or many of you. And if you are not, you should still take the quiz, because that is relevant. Great, thank you.
One of the other responses asking before, but it strikes me as what's really one of the main characteristics of this Goodreads model is that you have people who are evaluating content at face value, right? And that's sort of a very like socially motivated way of situating themselves as readers, and that, you know, in some ways comes from this longer tradition that includes something like, you know, a book club, right?
Right.
And I'm wondering where you see the technology in particular as constructing this certain type of logic. In other words, like, would you say that it's the you know, a pre-existing social desire and need that's producing technologies like this, or is it technologies, you know, changing the way that we think about reading?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because your question and your point is really well taken, because certainly social reading groups or book clubs have a long historical tradition, and there's a lot of we can trace where people are reading socially and not reading necessarily analytically, or they can talk about themselves and how the work affects their own personal lives. I think what changes with the digital age is that now it becomes global, and there's so many users that can weigh in on the book club, and so in that sense, you also have this in addition, this medium that's saying you can write in this many characters, you should produce stars or something like that, and that might be something that is fun for book club, but the book club certainly didn't have that before. So there's like a medium change, I think, where in say a book club situation you would just speak freely, and certainly the responses may not be great or analytical, but at least they're free flowing. And here I think Goodreads is tying the reader response into a certain medium, which isn't necessarily bad at all, but that's what it is doing. And then I think, but most importantly, it's just that it's spread all over the internet, so that I don't think it's possible to write a review on Goodreads and not be influenced by the other reviews, in the sense that, like, if I wrote a response, I feel like if I wrote, say, a literary critic analysis, that would be totally misplaced in a way, and I would want to review what other people are writing about before I just post something that doesn't seem relevant to the community. Okay. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Next up is Lisa Hahn from UCSB, and this is theorizing the query term.
Thank you. So this presentation isn't so much like a digital humanities project in the kind of conventional sense, but it's looking at a cultural practice that I think has a lot to do with the interfacing between the digital and the human, and how we think about databases in kind of a theoretical way. So in the past decade, the astronomical rise of Google web search and its rapid, uncritical adoption by the mass populace has led to a lot of scholarly suspicion. So Google is frequently criticized in kind of Marxist terms as this despotic engine that operates on like the endless consumption and production of your data, right? It is a vampiric and alienating cannibal, transforming our attention into monetizable information. John Battelle, writing on his encounters with Google in 2001, was the first to call the search engine a database of intentions. The concept of Google as a machine that feeds directly on human intention, in some senses correctly understands search as not merely just a tool for human convenience, but as a hegemonic regime of value. But is this intention really the fodder that fuels the search engine life cycle? Is it useful to think of it that way? So to understand search, I'm trying to grasp the query term in particular and its many functions as the intermediary between human curiosity and desire, and the ranking and sorting algorithms that make up the search engine. I think the keyword is, on one hand, intimately imbricated in our understanding of the modern world, but it's also part of a much longer history of how language functions in culture. As Raymond Williams puts it, it's important social and historical processes occur within language. So basically, I'm asking 4 main questions, and it's not because I know the answers, but I think that these questions are important, and it's meant to be kind of the beginning of discussion. So the first question, of course, is what is a keyword exactly? What is its role in translating intention? Who is the human constituted via the act of searching? And how do we study search culture as a style of communication, as a cultural index, and as a tool of empowerment? So by attending to the keyword as a site of struggle between industrial structures, users, and technologies, I'm hoping to reveal search as a nuanced activity that contains room for tactical intervention. So what is a keyword? First of all, so in 1953, Georges Monterey expanded upon the idea of terms connected to social history with the Motzklave, I don't know how to pronounce that exactly, or socially privileged keywords. And then when he developed his 1976 book, Keywords, A Vocabulary of Culture and Society, Raymond Williams was likewise attentive to the sociology of language and culture. And in the book, Williams defines keywords in two senses. They are significant binding words in certain activities in their interpretation, and they're significant indicative words in certain forms of thought. But I think what's really valuable about the way that Williams talks about keywords in his book is that he sees them as indexes of social change. And this indexical quality of the word is also at the heart of Voloshinov's philosophy of language. So the word in Voloshinov's term is a sign inflected with ideological, inter-individually produced accents or meanings. And as an index, search keywords are signs that through this exhaustive list of suggestions produced, right, are constantly being evaluated through their cultural use value. So the keyword as a site of struggle is always kind of cycling back and forth between this existence as kind of a more sensuous signifier, so the thing that builds cultural ideology, and a reified, written, accented term, which is an effect or artifact of cultural ideology. And I'm bringing in Voloshinov to say that this process isn't unique to the search engine, right? We've always inherited keywords, and we've always changed them. They convey a certain kind of cultural truth beyond our immediate reality. So this second question really comes in between thinking about the keyword and the searcher. So for Emin Husserl, who wrote about intention, intentionality is a key concept in understanding consciousness. So in his interpretation, his phenomenological interpretation, it's a correlational structure between intentional objects and intentional acts, what he calls noema and noesis. But one of the key questions to consider, I think, is where search stands in relation to this intentional structure. So is searching an intentional act, or does it also exist in kind of a pre-conscious perceptual territory? And if you're a philosopher, you know, are unconscious acts intentional? So we can think about this by kind of going back to specifics. A search engine, like the dictionary before it, works by generating a list of meanings represented as links underneath the word, right? The query term, like keywords in a more general sense, is kind of a desire to construct a terminus in the meaning of language. And the significance of this is that the whole culture of search and search engines operates on this presumption of semantic determinism, or the idea that everything in the world can be represented through a specific style of language. And that's a really like Foucauldian concept. It's a way of controlling discourse through the proliferation of a very specific type of discourse, which in this case is the language of the query. So in the eyes of Google, they would say the ideal act of searching would be a form of writing or typing keywords. It's like a frictionless communicative activity between your mind and the computer. But the idea that you can accurately ingest human intention from language, from the language of the query, rings false, because search engines, of course, are constantly in the position of catching up to natural language and thought. So I mean, how many times have you found yourself like searching for an answer to a question and then somehow looking for cat videos, right? We can't look at searching as an entirely purposive act, and this is something that Kylie Jarrett talks about in her work on Google search. There are affective factors that go into a person typing a keyword that that person might not be aware of. So for now, it's more useful maybe to think about search engines as maps that point and not as mind-reading machines. Additionally, the keyword and the index returns to us are not socially ubiquitous, but are contingent upon the individual searcher, the geographic location, and the language of the platform. So Anna Jobin and Olivier Glassy conducted a study of the word Switzerland to see how the engine performs this invisible hermeneutics of its own. And this is just me typing in these words into my version of Google, so that might not be the exact results that they got. But in this sense, keywords kind of operate like topics in a topic model, right? Like when you type in the word birth, it doesn't stand alone, but it stands with other words like control and pills, certificate, and so on. So ultimately, searching is about shaping. And if intention is involved, then maybe that is defined in retrospect by interpolation after the act, right? Is this what you meant? Is this what you wanted? And we may be tempted to say that search is a realm in which all things, all words and all searches become homogeneous by dint of being useful to the algorithm. But clearly ideas and curiosities have an existence outside of search that is opaque even to the human subject. And in that sense, the query term always remains a site of uncertainty, where two sides act on each other. It's not merely that a human base is translated into a search superstructure, but that search changes the way that we process our own desires and vice versa. So I want to talk just a little bit about this human subject constituted by search. So acquiring knowledge through Google is contingent upon both kind of the tactical capabilities of the content producers who, how good they are at pandering to the algorithms, and the judgments of the searching masses as a whole. So I think to a degree, it's useful to take kind of a structuralist approach to this question and say that the act of searching creates the searcher, knowing that companies like Google have a stake in peddling a certain kind of illusion of agency, right? So we interface with search engines in a way that allow us to see ourselves as knowledge seekers. But that doesn't mean that we see what's actually going on. PageRank returns to you what appears to be an answer to a question, even though algorithmically this process is really a matter of counting keywords and page views and correlating them to the search term. So what we access is really just a shortcut to content that has already been valued and vetted. And I think the next biggest lie is that search is about any one individual person, right? Search is dependent on the masses, millions of people who use the same keyword over and over. But that's not to say that a searching subject doesn't exist. I think producing the right keyword combination, first of all, is a matter of skill. Your ability to articulate your intentions depends already on your expectations of how Google's algorithms will work. So in other words, we all internalize strategies of search. And in this way, search engine optimization strategies preserve a style of language in online content. So SEO tactics basically commonly include things like clustering keywords together, using keywords in the title, labeling images with keywords, avoiding hyperbolic language that can be construed as spam. And that last point is actually interesting because spam detection algorithms are made to exclude content that is not human enough, right? But in the process, they're constricting language to what specific subset of people perceive as legitimate or professional. So in short, the machine is revising the human, and the humans revise the machine. This is an example of SEO, the way that the keywords become commodified. This is the Google AdWords site that advertisers use and content producers use, basically to see which combination of keywords would draw the most interest. But anyway, I just want to go to this really key question in regards to search that Jobin and Glassy posed. So will the Googleability of a piece of information become a condition of its social existence? And to me, the answer, which is maybe predetermined by the media industry's own paranoia about the issue, is that this state of social existence is already a foregone conclusion. Online media production today is as much about discovering what is already searchable and then producing content to fill that need, as much as it is about producing content and then attempting to optimize it afterwards. And that being the case, the argument isn't whether or not we live in a culture dominated by Google. I think we do live in search culture, and as such, we ought to consider it in a way that's critical and nuanced. So for instance, what opportunity is there for query terms to not merely mimic agency, but to actually empower? What could a query system look like that doesn't conceal the collective intelligence and the human-machine relationships that create language? Search keywords, in Williams' terms, are binding, significant, and indicative of social change, but they can also act as social witnesses. So this is a UN ad some of you may have seen, advocating for women. Michelle Zappa-Binga, for instance, talks about search as a community-building linguistic activity. I think that's a really different and good way of talking about it, and it's sort of along the lines also of Donna Haraway, who says, it's not about denying meanings and bodies, but building meanings and bodies. Search keywords are nodes of affiliation. They connect past and present. We link people across continents. So more than merely just opening our eyes to the fact that Google search is black box and lamenting our subordination to a machine we don't understand, my final argument is that we ought to recuperate keyword search and find ways for it to reveal and amplify and surprise and equip us as human beings. So.
So we don't have time for a Q&A, but we will have the respondent, so stay tuned for that on the video. And so you guys in the gold room is coming up with Liz Losh. The metadata is the message, #feminism as digital humanities work.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm sorry. Nice to meet you. That was really interesting. Thanks for.
So you guys are.
Should I start? Okay. Yeah. So I guess I was just thinking about. I mean, you mentioned the sheer quantity that's necessary for something like Google search to work, right? And for these keywords to accrue meaning, and that seems interesting in connection with the kind of sort of crude model of Google is doing this kind of massive mind reading sort of exercise, because it suggests a kind of probabilistic understanding of intention, right? Where that's a concept that can only be sort of accrued over multiple iterations of kind of the same type of action.
Right.
And so I guess I'm just curious about whether you see that kind of, it's an understanding that Google itself kind of masks, which I think you made like very nicely clear. But I'm wondering if you see artworks, literary works, just kind of cultural, reflections or objects sort of beginning to pick up on this understanding of intention and have some kind of, and use it in relation to other forms of human action. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, so you're asking if there are sort of artistic works that seek to kind of reveal the probabilistic understanding of intention.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to say that, just because this process is happening and perhaps, in its approximation, it can't be useful in other ways, right? I think,
sure.
Maybe that's, where the digital humanities comes in, is how can we come to understand this form of knowledge better through kind of artistic rendering of sort of database knowledge. But at the same time, it's about kind of remaining aware of the fact that, this is one particular form of knowledge, and it's one particular form of seeing ourselves, and it's not, confusing the two, right? Not confusing actual human intention with. I think that's what, it's easy for us now to kind of understand it as such as individuals, but the way that, for instance, political systems work or kind of larger industries work, it's very much conflating truth with, database. And so, so it's always good to have, I think, it's always meaningful to have, artists and, other approaches to that kind of question. Yeah.
Cool. Am I allowed to ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So I was just interested, because it's kind of surprising to me that people were talking about Google in terms of like a database of intention, because it seems like desire is like close to the operative word here, right? And so I was wondering, like, you mentioned someone thinking about it in terms of like the affective quality of searching, but yeah, what are people making that kind of distinction, or are they conflating those two ideas, or?
That's an interesting question. I'm not aware of like specifically like who specifically may be talking about desire, but I do think like, the idea is that when you think about affect, it's always thinking about how like the act of searching itself generates a kind of pleasure quotient, right? Like it makes you want to search more, and that's kind of I think that's as much as part of the equation as someone thinking of a question and then going on Google, right? So it's, in a way, it's two parts, like the act of coming to Google in the first place and the act of staying on Google.
That's so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Thanks very much.